All right, well, good evening. I'm John Campbell, and I think I know most of you, but I'm the Vice President of the NEBS. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight, continue Scott's welcome to this great program. So please continue to observe. I want to make one addition to Scott's intros. We have some Air Force recruiters with us tonight. You may know that 2023, all the services had trouble with meeting their goals. All the services put on a full court press, and all the services, with the exception of Marine Corps. All the services have put on a full court press, and this year I think I'm correct in saying that Army, Navy, and Air Force have all announced that at the end of the third quarter of FY25 they made their goals. So that's a great improvement, and that's the future of our military. Okay, in our last program, in April, we discussed the role of air power in great power competition. On October 26th, we'll circle back to naval power. We'll have as our guest Admiral Mike Manzier, formerly Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Warfighting. Quite an entertaining guy, and you can catch him on YouTube if you dig around a little bit. In 2026, we plan to get back to land power, and we may go back and take another look at space and cyber so we can cover all the domains in the context of great power competition. So all of this is part of a theme that we began last year, and that's the transition of the threat landscape from the post-9/11 era of small wars back to great power competition, how it affects our people, our forces, and our national strategy. We have a list of questions we'd like to cover. We'll never get to all those questions and get all the answers, but we can explore various aspects, and that's what we're doing tonight. So tonight our topic is great power competition, Russia, Iran, China, and the axis of resistance. And we'll explore how global rivalries are increasingly shaping regional power struggles and how those struggles are influencing events around the world. At the heart of our discussion is the so-called axis of resistance, a loosely aligned coalition led by Iran, backed by a network of proxy groups, and supported to various degrees by China and Russia. For years, this alliance positioned itself as a counterweight to the U.S. And Israeli influence in the Middle East, and through its proxies, Iran built a force capable of operating below the level of open war, underpinned by the threat of a future Iranian nuclear capability. But as we all know, a lot has changed in the region since the Israeli military campaign began in October 2023. The strength of the axis of resistance has been greatly reduced, if not eliminated, and with the direct intervention of the United States, the likelihood of future Iranian nuclear capability appears to have diminished. However, the core Israeli-Palestinian issue remains unresolved. Meanwhile, in Europe, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has entered its fourth year. Russian forces continue to make small territorial gains while conducting increasingly large drone and missile attacks on Ukrainian cities. Despite suffering over 1 million estimated casualties and facing mounting economic pressure, President Putin remains steadfast in his original pre-war demands, and Russia and North Korea continue to offer quiet but consistent support. Ukraine, however, endures. NATO is ramping up defense spending in anticipation of further Russian aggression, and President Trump has apparently lost patience with Putin, threatening to resume aid to Ukraine and establishing a September deadline to start peace talks. These developments around the world reflect a broader trend. Regional conflicts are no longer isolated. They're increasingly interconnected within the larger context of global powers. So there's a lot going on, and to help us make sense of these complex dynamics, we're joined tonight by two experts from the Institute for Study of War, which provides probably the deepest unclassified analysis of these areas of conflict. We have two speakers. Johanna Moore is the Middle East Deputy Team Lead and an expert on the axis of resistance. She graduated from American University with an MA in U.S. Foreign Policy and National Security with an emphasis in Middle East Studies. Our second speaker is Christina Harward. She's an analyst with the Institute's Russia-Ukraine team. She received a BA in Slavic Studies and Political Science from Columbia University and previously graduated from the Vaganova Academy of Russian Ballet in St. Petersburg, Russia, and danced professionally with companies in Estonia and the United States. Interesting story. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We look forward to hearing your remarks and to our audience discussion. Now, as always, we'll have a Q&A procedure, a Q&A session at the end. We'll use the same procedure that we always use. I think most of you are familiar with it. First, you can send a question to that email address up there. That will come to me, and I'll put that in the queue. And we'll leave that address up on the screen during the Q&A part. Second, there are 2 or 3 3x5 cards on each table. If you have a question, you can write it down, and please write legibly, because I got to read them. Write your questions down, hold the card up, and we'll have somebody come around and pick it up. And finally, as time permits, we'll take a few questions from the floor. Now, if you want to ask a question, hold up your hand, we'll bring you a mic, and we're videotaping this. We want to make sure that we get your question on the video, so wait till you get a mic to speak. We know that many of you may have strong opinions on these subjects, but as a courtesy to our guests and other audience members, please keep your questions brief and to the point. And we always have more questions than we have time for, so if we don't get your question, I'm sorry. If you write a question, we'll try to follow up with you. So that's our Q&A session. So that's all that I have for now. So Christina, I will ask you to go first with your opening remarks, followed by Johanna, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Thank you so much. So I got this very cool pop star Michael Jackson mic, so. Good evening, everyone. It's an absolute honor to be here with you this evening. My name is Christina Harwood, and I am an analyst at the Russia team at the Institute for the Study of War. Now, if any of you have seen a map of Ukraine with the front line drawn on it in the past 3 years and say 5 months, you have very likely already seen an ISW map. My team works 7 days a week to do everything from tracking military activity on the 1,200-kilometer front line in Ukraine at a tactical level to reading and analyzing just about everything that comes out of the high-ranking Kremlin officials' mouths every day to help us understand their strategic and grand strategic level objectives. Let's see. There we go. So we're here today, right, talking about the great power competition that is unfolding against the backdrop of the adversary entente that is forming between Russia, Iran, the People's Republic of China, and North Korea. Now, this group is currently neither an axis nor a hardened alliance, but rather it's a non-binding entente of deeply opportunistic and transactional partners with some common objectives. This entente aims to challenge the US-led world order, and each state is pursuing this objective within their regions across the world, with some aid from the others. Now, there are limits to each partner's willingness to support the others in this goal, but the risk to the US national security is nonetheless real. Russia's war in Ukraine has become a real focal point for this adversary entente, and we are seeing this entente unfold and strengthen on the battlefield. So that being said, today I'll be covering 3 big questions. First, why does the war in Ukraine matter to US interests in Europe, but also in Asia? Second, is there a risk of Russian NATO war in the future? And finally, how do we prevent a Russian victory in Ukraine that could increase this risk? So to start, we have our first question. Let's look at how Russia's war has implications for US national security around the world. To understand the implications of this war, we have to first understand what Vladimir Putin is actually trying to do. Putin has stuck to the original demands he made in 2021 when he was massing forces across the border, and in February 2022 when he announced this full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now, the Kremlin likes to use really strange terms like denazification to try to cover up their true intent. But what Putin has been demanding since day one is the removal of the democratically elected government of Ukraine, the installation of a pro-Russian proxy puppet government in Kiev, changes to Ukraine's sovereign constitution about its NATO aspirations, the abolition of NATO's long-held open door policy, and major restrictions on Ukraine's military such that it cannot defend itself against future aggression. Now, Putin annexed, let's see, we have a laser here. Putin annexed Crimea in the south in 2014, and in 2022, he annexed Luhansk Oblast, Donetsk Oblast, Zaporizhia Oblast, and Kherson Oblast. Putin, however, has wider territorial ambitions beyond these 5 regions. The rhetoric coming out of the Kremlin day in and day out about these intentions has been consistent and repeated for 3+ years of war. As recently as a few weeks ago, for example, at an international forum in St. Petersburg, Putin reiterated his long-held belief that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people. Therefore, quote, therefore, all of Ukraine is ours. I'm going to repeat that to make sure I get that right. Putin said, all of Ukraine is ours. We have some more indications that Putin wants more of Ukraine. Putin consistently refers to areas of occupied Ukraine as Novorossiya. This means New Russia. Now, what is Novorossiya? This is an invented region from the time of the Russian Empire, but to this day, the Kremlin holds that this Novorossiya region is integral to the modern Russian state. Now, here you can see a map of the parts of Ukraine that have been traditionally considered part of this concept of Novorossiya. It's pretty easy to see that not only is this a lot further than the front line, but it's also beyond the 5 oblasts that they have already claimed. Here we have Odessa circled in the south of Ukraine. Putin and other high-ranking officials in his inner circle often and repeatedly call Odessa a, quote, Russian city. Putin has also recently held meetings with regional officials that were likely very concerted and highly staged, in which the regional officials begged Putin to take Sumy in the north. Now, these are just a handful of the examples that we're seeing coming out of the Kremlin every single day. These are not one-offs, and these are not the opinions of a select few people. The Russian information space is highly controlled by the Kremlin, and so the fact that Russian state media is amplifying these statements for the Russian population is a sure sign that they have the Kremlin's stamp of approval. So what Putin is ultimately wanting out of Ukraine is full Ukrainian capitulation. Even if he doesn't conquer all of the territory that he wants in this round of war, he is setting things up so he can do it in the next. He didn't stop at Crimea in 2014, and he's not going to stop at the front lines where they are today or the 5 regions that he has illegally annexed. So this brings me to my question. If Putin were able to have his victory that he wants in Ukraine, what does that mean for the US and our allies? A full Russian victory of Ukraine would bring Russian forces right up to NATO's flank, from the Arctic Ocean in the north to the Black Sea in the south. Now, these would be combat-experienced Russian forces with intimate knowledge of the technologies and the tactics that are shaping the modern 21st century battlefield. Additionally, a full Russian victory would also very likely see most Ukrainian forces subsumed into the Russian military. This would deny the West the benefits of learning from Ukrainian forces' innovations and ideas and skills, and of working with Ukraine's tremendous defense industrial base, which has an incredible production capacity. Additionally, a Russian victory over Ukraine would allow Russia to build bases directly opposite the borders of Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. Now, the threats that this sort of Russian victory would pose would absolutely require a US response. The United States would have to deploy significant ground forces to Europe to either deter or even defend against Russian aggression. Additionally, the US would have to deploy many of its stealth aircraft, like the F-22s and F-35s, which are the only aircraft that are capable of penetrating and destroying the highly advanced Russian air defense systems. But these forces and these aircraft are necessary to deter and confront China and defend Taiwan. So this sort of threat of a Russian victory in Ukraine would put American policymakers in an incredibly difficult decision, on an incredibly difficult place, having to make a decision between allocating troops and forces between defending our allies in Europe and defending our allies in Taiwan. So now we turn to our next question. Is there actually a risk of Russia-NATO war? The risk is real, particularly if Putin gets what he wants in Ukraine. So, for example, high-ranking Kremlin officials in the past year or two have started to publicly threaten the Baltic states and Finland. Now, I know it's pretty easy to dismiss this as empty threats, but it's important to look at what they're actually saying. They are talking about the Baltics and Finland the same way they talked about Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. Now, what do these three states have in common? In Moldova, Russia militarily intervened in 1992 and to this day maintains a contingent of troops in that country illegally. Georgia obviously was invaded by Russia in 2008, and Ukraine, we know what happened, 2014 and 2022. Russia, in short, has been using the same playbook for over 30 years. They are trying to justify each of these military actions using the same narratives and claims. So, a major factor that we're going to have to consider when we start to forecast when Russia might be able to pose a threat against our European allies is looking at Russia's ability to rearm and reconstitute its forces after the war in Ukraine. But here's the thing, Russia is already preparing for the war with NATO. Russia is preparing its border and restructuring its forces, it's boosting its defense industrial base, and it's militarizing its society. Now, of course, these efforts are dual purpose. They, on the one hand, are preparing Russia for a long and protracted war in Ukraine, but they are also setting Russia up for a wider conflict. So first, they're preparing their border. We can tell by satellite imagery that they're expanding their bases along their border with Finland and that they're deploying significant amounts of equipment to these new bases. Russia is also dramatically expanding its administrative and bureaucratic infrastructure in order to quickly process the paperwork needed to mobilize and conscript hundreds of thousands of Russians at Putin's choice, timing of his choosing, without the bottlenecks. I know we have some people here working in recruitment. You know it's not a slow process. Next, Russia has split its western military district, seen here on the map, back into the Leningrad military district and the Moscow military district. So today's Leningrad military district is now bordering new member Finland and NATO member Finland and old NATO members Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, as well as Poland, when you remember that Kaliningrad is over here in the west. And the restored Moscow military district is bordering Belarus, which at this point is de facto pretty much a part of Russia, and northeastern Ukraine. Obviously, right now, all of the military districts across Russia are focusing on the war in Ukraine. But after the war, this split of the L and MMDs will allow the Leningrad district to purely focus on force projection against NATO's northeastern flank. So next, Russia is putting tremendous effort into boosting its defense industrial base. For example, they're increasing their production of T-90 tanks, but they are deploying almost none of them to the front line in Ukraine. They are instead choosing to stockpile them. Russia's defense industrial base is learning valuable lessons today about sanctions evasion and scaling up production based on the needs of the battlefield today. And lastly, and this is, to be honest, the one that keeps me up at night, the Kremlin is preparing their society for a war against NATO. Russia is significantly expanding its military and youth patriotic programs that are very similar to the ones they used in the Soviet Union. They are doing this both in Russia and in occupied Ukraine in order to exploit the youth and the teenagers in occupied Ukraine as well for their militarization projects. Russia is training children how to drop grenades from drones using video games. Russia is employing teenagers at the infamous factory in Tatarstan that produces the Shahed drones that Iran initially supplied to them a couple years ago. Now, the Kremlin is consolidating, it looks like, around this informal state ideology that at its foundation is anti-Western. The Kremlin has started special programs throughout the entire country that looks to place veterans of the war in Ukraine who performed very highly on the battlefield and were awarded state rewards, trying to place them in government from the local level to the federal government level. This is allowing Russia to lay the groundwork to ensure that future generations of government leaders are militarized, but more importantly, loyal. These specially chosen cadres of veterans will ensure that future governments continue to hold the beliefs of the modern-day government, meaning that Putin's goals in Ukraine and against and against NATO are unlikely to die with him. So the most effective and least costly way to reduce or even defeat Russia's ability to launch a war against NATO is to enable Ukraine now to bring Putin to the negotiating table and find a solution to this war that is in the interests of the US, Europe, and Ukraine. So this brings us to our final question. How do we bring Putin to the negotiating table when he has refused every effort so far? Here we need to understand what is going on in Putin's head. Putin's public statements about the past year have offered some really tremendous insight into how he is thinking and his calculus. He has explicitly stated that Russia does not need to achieve his objectives on the battlefield quickly, but that as long as the troops are making gains every day, even if they are slow and at incredible costs, Putin is satisfied. Now, this tells us that Putin is operating under 4 key assumptions. First, Putin thinks that Russia can outlast the West's will to support Ukraine and Western military aid to Ukraine. Second, Putin thinks that Russian forces can hold any of the territory that they seize on the battlefield. Third, Putin believes that Russian forces will be able to sustain their tempo of attacks, even if they are marginal gains at tremendous costs. And finally, Putin believes that Ukraine will be completely unable to acquire and sustain the manpower and weapons it needs to push back against Russian advances, let alone launch their own operationally significant counteroffensive operations. These 4 assumptions make up what we at ISW call Putin's theory of victory. At its essence, it is that Putin has and continues to believe that time is on his side. So, if Putin's theory of victory is predicated on his confidence in the Russian military and its longevity, are there any weaknesses that we can exploit to bring him to the table? Short answer is yes. Putin obviously did not prepare his military, his economy, or his society for a long and expensive war. He thought this would be over in a matter of weeks, not years. But Russia's economy is tied to its war effort, and the war effort is tied to the economy. Now, battlefield losses are absolutely key and is driving this relationship between the war effort and the economy. So let's look at some of these losses briefly. Estimates of Russia's manpower losses have recently reached the 1 million mark. I'm going to say that again. There are estimates that Russia has lost over 1 million men killed and wounded. Moscow is demanding that Russian regions meet federally mandated recruitment quotas, but the regional governments are struggling to meet these numbers. So what they're doing is they're offering these exorbitantly high payouts for new recruits who sign their name on the dotted line. These incredibly high payouts are not sustainable financially. Next, we'll look briefly at the equipment losses. So equipment losses are difficult to get exact numbers on, but there's some really amazing open source work going on that is looking at photos and videos on the internet to confirm destroyed vehicles. So these open source has found, they've been able to confirm that between February 2022 and a few weeks ago in July when I checked their numbers, that Ukraine has destroyed about 4,000 tanks, 6,000 infantry fighting vehicles, 700 armored personnel carriers, and about 1,400 artillery systems. Now, of course, this is only the numbers that this project can confirm, which means the actual numbers are much, much higher. Western estimates, for example, found that in 2024 alone, Ukraine destroyed 1,400 tanks and over 3,700 IFVs and APCs. And this is just destroyed. We haven't even touched damaged vehicles. I mentioned before that Russia is boosting its defense industrial base. The factories are currently running, a lot of them at 24/7 regime schedules, but they're struggling to produce enough new equipment to replace these losses one for one. So what Russia is doing is it's tapping into its stockpiles. But these stockpiles are from the Soviet era, which means they are finite. Again, open source estimates, looking at satellite imagery of these open store areas, estimate that Russia had between 45 and 52% of their pre-war levels of tanks, IFVs, and APCs at the end of last year in 2024. Now, Russia is, of course, leaning on its partners in Pyongyang, Tehran, and Beijing to help it procure the materiel that it needs. But there are limitations in these relationships. We all know that North Korea has supplied millions of artillery shells to Russia, but it turns out just about half of them were duds. The Russian-Iranian strategic partnership that they signed in January of this year lacked a mutual defense clause. Now that's very insightful. It's telling us that both sides are unwilling to help the other during wartime. Beyond that, Iran also lacks stockpiles or real defense industrial capacity to give Russia the material that it would need. Now the PRC, of course, does have the stockpiles and the defense industrial capacity that it could help Russia with. But to this day, we have seen China refuse to engage in such direct support, likely out of fear of Western economic repercussions. So again, these battlefield losses are having multiple impacts on the Russian economy. Take, for example, the labor shortages. Russia is suffering from massive labor shortages. These are affecting their defense industrial base's ability to recruit new employees to keep these factories going on the 24/7 cycle. But every man recruited into the military is one less man who can work at home. So the high financial incentives I mentioned previously that the Russian regional governments are offering their new recruits, plus the salaries that are incredibly high that the defense industrial base enterprises are having to offer all the Russians, mean that salaries across the board in Russia are rising and prices are rising. Russian inflation has risen dramatically throughout the war. Now, Russia keeps claiming that it's hovering just under 10%, but if you look at the prices of basic goods, this really has to be a lie. They're covering up the actual inflation numbers to their domestic audiences and their international audiences. So further economic problems at home that are being fueled by these battlefield losses are going to force Putin eventually to make decisions between balancing butter and guns that he has been avoiding doing for most of this war. For example, higher or even unsustainable personnel losses on the battlefield could push Putin into a corner where he has to decide if he wants to do another partial mobilization. He did one of these in September of 2022. It was deeply unpopular. If he did it again, it would surely be equally as unpopular, perhaps even more, because the Russian government has spent the last 2 years telling the Russian people that Russian troops on the battlefield are achieving success after success, and they've explicitly stated that there is no need for another partial mobilization. But support from the population is critical for any authoritarian regime, and Putin is really no different. He actually does care about the butter and the guns. But Putin thinks time is on his side, and he can win this war before he has to even make those difficult decisions. But we can change that. So given the intertwined nature of Russia's economic problems on the one hand and their losses on the battlefield on the other, any successful efforts to change Putin's theory of victory and bring him to the table will require both economic instruments and military aid to Ukraine. One without the other is not going to be sufficient. Only then will Putin then feel pressure, reevaluate his thinking, and agree to actually end the war. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. All right, thank you all for having me tonight. It's been wonderful meeting you all. For those of you who I have not had a chance to meet yet, my name is Johanna Moore. I am one of the Middle East analysts with the Institute for the Study of War, and I am also one of our deputy team leads there. So our Middle East team at ISW covers the entire Arabic-speaking region. We have a partner organization, the Critical Threats Project. They are with the American Enterprise Institute, and they serve to really complement the work that we do. So the Arabic-speaking side really covers everything from the Palestinian territories to Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Secondarily, we will cover the Gulf and Turkey. And our Iran team over at the Critical Threats Projects helps complement that by looking at the internal Iranian domestic space and regime calculus. So when we bring that together, we have a holistic picture of Iran's strategy in the region and its thinking and how it really pursues some of its grand strategic aims. So today, really what I want to do is paint a picture about where we are in the region, because over the past 2 years, we have seen fundamental changes in the security dynamic within the region and the dynamics between the players there. And I think it's really prompted and opened up some new opportunities for the United States to work with some of our partners in the region and push back on some of our adversaries. So I'm going to start off just by kind of painting a picture of where we are, and then kind of walking back and explaining how the Middle East really fits into U.S. security policy today, and again, within the adversary entente writ large, and what that means for what we can take away for future conflicts. So, as I mentioned, the Middle East has changed dramatically over the past 2 years. Iran and its axis of resistance have been badly weakened from fighting over the past 2 years, but they have not altered their long-term strategic objectives. And that is really key as we think policy-wise about what we can be doing and making sure that we don't have a somewhat episodic prioritization of the region. Iran's theory on how to project power in the region and externalize threats to the regime has fundamentally been turned on its head. Iran's partners in the axis of resistance once served to advance Iranian political, economic, and military objectives in the region, and are fundamentally unable to do so at this time because of how badly they have been weakened. For example, Hamas has been defeated as a military organization and is unable to threaten Israel in the same way that it was prior to October 7th. We assess that it would take Hamas years to rebuild the capabilities that it once had on October 6th prior to that attack. Hezbollah similarly has been severely damaged from the Israeli campaign that was waged between September and November of 2024. The Israeli campaign destroyed much of Hezbollah's infrastructure along the southern Lebanese border and destroyed weapons caches across Lebanon, and most importantly, it destroyed much of Hezbollah's domestic weapons production capabilities. And that's really been key as we've seen the fall of Assad. And I will touch on that in just a moment. Now, Hezbollah is a really key partner in this axis, and I want to focus on it for just a moment because Hezbollah served as the leading member of the axis of resistance. It really was the pinnacle member, the most senior member. It was the one that Iran entrusted with the most advanced weaponry that it had, and it served to train the other members of the axis of resistance. So its defeat has crippled that component of the axis, and it's no longer able to serve as that linchpin to develop the rest of these partners. Now, Hezbollah today is really struggling to reconstitute its forces. As I mentioned, with the fall of Assad, Hezbollah has been badly weakened in this regard. Syria once served as the primary ground line of transportation for Iran and its axis. Iran would transport its weaponry from Iran through Iraq and across Syria into Lebanon, or through Jordan into the Palestinian territories, into the West Bank, or into Gaza. With the fall of Assad, those networks have been disrupted and gone to the wind, fundamentally. We still see some regular smuggling networks going through Syria and into Lebanon, though those are being struck and targeted by the new Syrian transitional government. So Hezbollah no longer has that key route that really served as a lifeline for the organization. But Israel's campaign also destroyed the domestic weapons production capabilities. So Hezbollah is hurting in a very, very bad way to try and rebuild. We've seen it try and seek other ways by bringing in literal pallets of cash, loading that onto a plane, loading it onto a cargo plane. They've tried boats, air, land, and sea, and all have started to be interdicted by the Lebanese armed forces and by Israel itself. And that, in addition to sanctions, have also crippled the organization's ability to pay its members. And so we're starting to see some lack of support for Hezbollah. Its once proud support base, no longer being paid, is starting to lose its support for Hezbollah. Now, the Iranian-backed Iraqi militias, they have not been militarily defeated in the same way that Hezbollah and Hamas have. However, they have been rendered unwilling to engage the US and Israel in the same way that many of these other actors have. between October of 2023 and the spring of 2024, they did wage an attack campaign on Israel and on U.S. forces in the region, and U.S. self-defense strikes hit and killed many of their senior commanders, which is why they were no longer willing to take on that cost, as some of the other organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah were. And we've seen that carry through this most recent conflict, the 12 Days War, where these actors gave relatively watered down statements condemning the Israeli strikes. They threatened to intervene should the U.S. become involved, but fundamentally they did not follow through on that threat. And that was really a remarkable show of just how badly these groups have been weakened, that at the moment when Iran came under attack, Iran's partners did nothing. Now, the past 2 years have rendered Iran's means of externalizing threats to the regime virtually useless. As I mentioned, these partners that Iran has failed to intervene during this 12-day war in June, and secondarily, Iran's ballistic missile program, which served as its primary means of deterrence against Israel, failed to prevent Israeli strikes on Iranian territory. As a result, we saw something particularly interesting within the Iranian regime. Iran started to shift its focus to its nuclear program as an alternative means of deterrence against Israel and the United States. Now, while Iran continues to maintain that this program is a peaceful civilian program, it has undertaken several steps which are inconsistent with that. Primarily, it has enriched uranium far beyond the civilian levels, this would support rapid breakout of weaponization should Iran choose. Now, at this point in time, we don't assess that Iran has chosen to pursue a weaponized program. However, they are essentially creating the conditions which would enable rapid weaponization should the regime change its mind and choose to do so. One of the other steps that Iran has taken is to create and develop additional facilities which can produce components necessary for an actual nuclear weapon. One of the strikes that Israel hit between June 12th and June 24th was a metallization facility which would have produced the nuclear core for a weapon. And thirdly, and one of the most telling indications of Iran's potential willingness or interest in weaponization is the computer modeling programs that they have run simulating an actual nuclear explosion. This is a stage of the process that we would expect them to conduct prior to an actual nuclear explosion test. Now, following the 12 Days War and the strikes that Israel and the US conducted, Iran's uranium enrichment program has been effectively destroyed from US and Israeli strikes. Despite this, Iran's uranium enrichment stockpile remains a long-term threat should Iran choose to weaponize over the coming years. Nuclear negotiations, Iran maintains that it reserves the right to enrich uranium on Iranian soil. This is in direct contradiction to what the US currently demands in the negotiations, which is zero enrichment. And so at this point in time, we see no reconciliation and no moderation within stances, which would bring Iran to the negotiation table. So what we're also seeing from out of Europe is the E3 nations who have threatened to implement snapback sanctions, so additional sanctions on Iran, should Iran fail to come to the table and negotiate with the US. But then also if they fail to resume cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And I think an important note on this discussion that we're seeing surrounding the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, is there is a tendency for the discussion to be concerned that if the IAEA does not have access to these sites, that there will essentially be a lack of knowledge on what is happening in these programs. And while the IAEA does provide some insight, what we found leading up to this most recent conflict is that the IAEA was not the primary source of intelligence on the Iranian nuclear program. Those came from foreign intelligence services. So we want to frame this discussion in such a way where we can kind of understand the pros and cons and the roles that the IAEA really plays in here, although the IAEA still remains an important player within the international community in ensuring that Iran adheres to some of these standards. Now, while Iran has stated that it's open to negotiations, Iran, similar to Russia, is very crafty with the negotiations and very crafty with its rhetoric. It has been very happy to negotiate, so long as we negotiate on their terms. Very happy to negotiate, so long as Iran can continue to enrich uranium on Iranian soil. So, being very cautious about what Iran is saying and what it actually means. Iran has maintained that it wants to enrich uranium on Iranian soil. And right now we assess that unless there are changes to the terms of agreement which would allow Iran to enrich on Iranian soil, we do not see any indications that Iran would change its policy and accept such an agreement. Now, this brings us to looking forward a little bit, and I want to really explain how the Middle East fits within the broader policy discussion, because I think it sets us up well for a discussion on where we go next here. Now, as many of you know, the Middle East right now is really not the top policy issue. Right now, the Middle East can really best be characterized as a supporting line of effort. Now, supporting line of effort, really you don't want to be putting the bulk of your resources there. You really want to be allocating the minimum amount of resources to pursue your objectives so that you can keep your resources and attention on your priority issues, which are defined as Russia and China. Now, one of the concerns we've seen over the past 2 years is as these conflicts flare up, particularly when we see engagements from Israel and Iran, particularly when Iran threatens to fire ballistic missile and drones at Israel, the US has moved a massive amount of forces and resources into the region, leaving other areas vulnerable. An excellent example of this was in October 2024 when Iran was preparing to launch a ballistic missile and drone attack on Israel. The US moved virtually all of its carrier strike groups out of the Pacific to the Gulf. That kind of reallocation of resources is inherently dangerous and disrupts the planning and prioritization process of our resources. Now, this gets to why the Middle East can't be a somewhat episodic prioritization for the US. We need to find opportunities to work with our partners long term and to develop these kind of strategies where we can have a long-term plan in place to counter these threats, because as I noted in the beginning, these actors, while they are damaged and weakened now, do have the same long-term objectives, and we do expect them to build back to a capacity where they could threaten the US and its allies and interests in the region long term. So this brings us a little bit more to the future and trying to understand how Iran fits into the adversary entente, because this is what Iran is going to be using to develop and rebuild and move forward in rebuilding itself. Now, these are some of the fundamental aspects that fit into the Russo-Iranian relationship. The Russo-Iranian relationship goes well beyond military cooperation. The core of it, the core of the Russo-Iranian relationship, is a mutually binding interest in challenging and eventually overthrowing the US-led world order. This is key because one of the things that we look at is this broadening of cooperation, again, beyond just simply learning from each other's military technology. We see them repeat, we see them learn from each other, learn from how to use the information space, understand how our domestic population responds to certain narratives, how does our political space respond to certain threats, and use that to learn and adapt to try and navigate and advance their own interests in the region. Now, that being said, military cooperation is still a large part of this relationship. This is an example in a timeline just up through September of 2024 of some of the military technology that they have each shared with each other. Now, military cooperation between these two goes far beyond just military sales. The military cooperation that we see heavily factors into their own research and development. And one of the key things to remember here is that these systems are being pitted against NATO systems. So as they learn what works and what doesn't work, they are able to apply it to future conflicts with the US and its allies. That is proliferated across the adversary entente that we have defined here today. As China looks for a potential conflict with Taiwan, it will be interested to know what sort of systems work best against our own air defense systems, what sort of drone warfare is most effective, can the US bring to bear the weapons necessary for such a conflict. Now, one of the key things, as I mentioned, is how these cycles are so intertwined. Because they have been so interconnected, one of the key things we want to highlight here is that these conflicts can't fundamentally be separated from each other. As Iran sends drones to Russia to be fielded and applied in combat, Iran learns from those applications and uses them itself in learning how to apply them in combat against Israel and its allies. Now, there are various situations in which it's found more and less success. For example, Iran fundamentally failed in applying drone warfare against Israel. For any of you who know the flight time of a Shahed drone, it takes about 6 hours to get from Iran to Israeli territory. So the Israelis saw that one coming. That was not a surprise for anyone working in the air defense systems that evening. So Iran, in that sense, didn't fail. It wasn't able to apply it in a functional sense. Now, Hezbollah, by comparison, learned how to make it happen because they were able to use the terrain for more short distance attacks and be much more precise in what they were going after. So again, you see that learning, adjusting, and applying it in real time through these conflicts. Now, moving on to the Iranian and Chinese relationship. This one is a particularly interesting relationship because thus far it has been heavily economic. China has been one of the biggest supporters helping Iran subvert sanctions. China is a massive purchaser of Iranian oil. However, we still see this proliferation of cooperation well beyond any sort of economic cooperation. China does supply the base chemical fuel needed for Iran's ballistic missile program. It is one of the largest suppliers of that. China also supports, in the same similar diplomatic way that Russia does, by perpetuating various advantageous Iranian lines and narratives. China attempts to be a kind of diplomatic mediator in the region, though we are under no impression that China is a neutral or fair party in that sense. Now, this is an excellent example of some of the ship-to-ship transfers that we have seen between Iran and China. As I mentioned, China is an avid and active partner in helping Iran subvert sanctions, and what we see is Iranian tankers leave their ports, they will pair up with a ship, usually somewhere in the Gulf, sometimes a little closer to the Philippines, and do these ship-to-ship transfers of the oil on the cargo tankers. And that ship that they transfer it to will then move on to China and Shanghai. This is just one of those examples, as you can see. Let me see if I can. This is those ship-to-ship transfers, and when you see it on the radars and on the navigation charts, there's some fantastic work in the open source showing this. Oftentimes, these ships will turn off their transponders, and so they will effectively disappear. You can't see them, but every so often we get lucky and they forget to turn it off, and you see them start to do little circles in one area of the map, and you say, huh, that doesn't look right. And sure enough, you notice that another ship had come in real close, and they've been doing this little dance as they transfer the oil. And so we're able to track these shipments and seeing them move all the way from the Gulf here through all the way around to Shanghai. This is another example of a recent shipment that happened just in May. As I mentioned, sometimes it happens in a little closer down here towards Singapore. These transfers, Iran does have I believe, a floating barge where it is able to deposit oil and have it transferred over to other vessels. And so, again, this relationship and the lengths that they go to transfer this oil to China is key for them. The Iranian oil exports are what fuel and fund the regime. It is their primary source of income that keeps the regime afloat. It is what enables them to fund the other members of the Axis of Resistance to build more weapons, which they also send to the other members of the Axis of Resistance. The Iranian economy is one of the linchpins in ensuring the regime's stability. We have seen protests time and time again pop up in Iran due to economic downturn as a result of poor economic trade and exports of Iranian oil. This is a key issue that we're looking at going forward. Now, after this 12 days war, we've seen an interesting shift out of Iran. Iran is no longer interested in only focusing on its economic cooperation with China. Iran is having a little bit of a hard time with Russia these days. I wasn't happy with how little Russia did in this most recent conflict to intervene and to support it against Israel and the US. It is extremely disappointed that Russia did not come to its aid, that it did not supply any military equipment, and as we saw as a result, Iran's nuclear program was decimated and about half of its ballistic missile program was destroyed. And so Iran is starting to look for a partner to backfill that relationship a little bit. It hasn't abandoned Russia. It hasn't abandoned that military cooperation. Iran is still a key partner in that. However, Iran has made it very clear that they're looking for China to step up into that new role. Right now, we haven't seen any clear indications that China is willing to do that yet. Similar reasons to what Christina laid out earlier, where China can be largely hesitant to come into direct conflict or risk retaliation from the US. Iran is really seeking fundamentally, and at a bare minimum, some sort of military weapons purchases. Now, there's been some talk about China potentially selling fighter jets to them, I believe it was the J-10s. Again, it's unclear if China is actually willing to do that, but that fighter jet would be inadequate against the F-35s that Israel has. So Iran has to weigh whether it's willing to purchase capabilities like that at the expense of it potentially being destroyed in a future conflict. Now, Iran has also sought something more expansive and more intensive, which would be something along the lines of a security compact of some sorts. But China has made no advancements on that end, has not even commented on it despite Iranian statements and Iranian interest in the open source. And so at this time, we don't believe China is willing to make that move into this new partnership with Iran. Now, this brings us to how we should be thinking about these conflicts going forward and what we should be thinking about. As I mentioned, we need to be extremely cautious about this kind of episodic prioritization of the Middle East. Our strategic interests in the region will be there and our interests and the adversaries there will seek to pursue those interests over the long term, whether we are particularly engaged or not. And so it is essential that we create these lasting partnerships and capabilities with our allies. And we're starting to see that a little bit more today, particularly with Jordan and Saudi Arabia stepping up. Now, Iran and members of the Axis of Resistance have been weakened, but again, they have not changed their strategic objectives. We do have indications that they are already starting to try and rebuild and that they will continue to do so in order to pursue these objectives to undermine US strategic interests and to threaten the US and its allies in the region. Iran will look to its partners in the adversary entente to rebuild, and other members will look to apply lessons from these 2 years to future conflicts. One such example on everyone's mind is Taiwan. One thing to be mindful of is we saw Iran struggle to make any serious impact with its ballistic missile and drone attacks on Israel. We can't take for granted or any sort of assumptions that China will struggle in the same way. The distance between Iran and Israel is significantly longer than the short distance between mainland China and Taiwan. They will not suffer the same long flight time that Iran has. Furthermore, what we saw in Gaza was particularly interesting, where the Israeli army noted that they were not able to maintain air superiority at low altitudes because of the low-cost drones that the militias were using, including Hamas and several other Iranian-backed militias. So the U.S. and its partners need to fundamentally reevaluate its drone program and how to apply these lessons and regain the sort of air superiority at these low altitudes that larger fighter jets are not able to accomplish. With that, thank you.
Wow, I'm exhausted. So a couple of things. You know, we always videotape these, and after we edit them and get approval from the speakers, we put them on our website. I don't know how many views we get, probably not very many, but this one will be up in a couple of weeks. And this may be one you want to go back and take a look at, because if you're like me, there was a lot of information here that maybe was hard to, more than I could handle. So I'm going to go back and take a look at this. One other comment I'll make, you know, this was the brainchild of Mark Liebman. Mark has had a long time relationship with ISW and put together the concept of inviting some of their top analysts here to speak. So I think it's a really substantive program, and I give Mark a lot of credit for that. So let's give our speakers and Mark a big hand. Okay, so we'll start our Q&A. Chuck, you want to bring up the map? And the email address, if you can see it there, it's ndvsquestions@gmail.com. I've already gotten a couple to that website or that email box. I've got a couple of questions to start off with, and then we'll throw it open to question cards, email, or questions from the audience. So this one is for Christina. You know, early after the invasion, the administration expressed concern about supplying certain kinds of arms because it might trip a red line and blah, blah, blah. We haven't heard a lot of that lately, and I'm not going to make that a political issue. But the question is, you know, Putin has staked his personal and political prestige on the success of this war. It's kind of not going well for him right now. The trend is not. Do you think he has an off-ramp? And does he want an off-ramp? And can you survive an off-ramp?
Well, are we good? Yeah, cool. I will speak to the first part briefly. So, yes, the Russians have listed a lot of red lines that we dare not cross for fear of Russian nuclear use. And I've lost count of all of these red lines. All of them have been crossed, and nothing has happened. So examples coming to mind, U.S. and European supplies of F-16s to Ukraine, that was explicitly labeled a red line. U.S. supplies of HIMARS, red line. U.S. allowing Ukraine to strike military assets within Russia with ATACMS missiles was a red line. So a lot of this rhetoric has proven empty. And if you take a look of when this rhetoric pops up, there is a very suspiciously interesting correlation that they like to pull out from their toolbox, the nuclear saber rattling, right at times of intense debate in the West, typically in the United States, about Ukraine. So nuclear saber rattling really does spike during maybe congressional debates about aid provisions, or last year the debate with the Biden administration, and then within the Biden administration about, again, allowing these ATACMS strikes to occur. That is when they bring out the nuclear saber rattling. In terms of Putin thinking the war is not going very well for him, I think he's winning. He thinks he's winning. It's not the full conquest that he initially wanted. It is not the removal of Zelensky and everyone else in the government from Kyiv the way he wanted. But I think, like I said, he is setting things up to get that eventually. I think no matter which way, if we ever are able to actually sit down at the table and get some sort of peace settlement, the Kremlin will try to spin it as a victory. And then they will probably go back into their rooms and hatch up a plan of how to reinvade in order to get more territory the next time around.
Great, thank you. The other question, second question is for Johanna. You mentioned at the end of your remarks Saudi Arabia and Egypt. It seems to me that the moderate Gulf states have been pretty much absent from this whole discussion between Israel and Iran, and they certainly have a vested interest. What do you think their strategy and long-term outlook is?
The Gulf states have a tendency to hedge. Right now, and what we've seen over the past 2 years is a bit of back and forth in language in what they say publicly versus what they say in conversations with U.S. and U.S. officials. Now, what we see is that a lot of their interests vis-a-vis Iran actually align with ours. And so in that regard, they are a reliable partner. And what we've seen most recently, I would say in the past few months, is a lot of these Gulf partners step up and actually take advantage of some of the opportunities that we've seen. Not directly against Iran or many of its partners, but one of the most notable areas of this is actually the new Syrian transitional government, where, as I mentioned earlier, Syria used to be a really key part of Iran's network to transfer arms to its partners. It was a wonderful partner for the Ayatollah, and now it's gone. And what a lot of these Gulf countries have done is come in and provide funding and provide investment for this new Syrian transitional government, because one of the key issues going forward is the stability of this new government and what that future is going to look like for them. What we've seen Iran try to do is pick at various ethno-sectarian issues to try and undermine that stability and sort of rip apart the fabric of society in Syria so that it can continue its operations through Syria to fund its various proxies and arm its proxies. So the Gulf partners have taken a different approach, I would say, is using that kind of economic venue or avenue to sort of counter Iran, and Syria is one excellent example of that.
I was glad to see you mention, Johanna, the National Defense Strategy. But if you read that, you know it way overcommits what we have the capacity and capability to do. I think this is a question from Congressman Self, and it's a great one. And actually, let me read the question, then I'll rephrase it a little bit. It says, will we prioritize defense of Taiwan over defending Europe should Russia take all of Ukraine? But in a bigger sense, and that was before you spoke, Johanna, it also applies in the Middle East. We have all these competing areas of the world where we have vital national interest. The pacing issue is China. How are we going to juggle all those balls? This is a little bit above your pay grade, I know that.
Just a tad, a few GS levels. That will fundamentally be a policy question, to turn it back to apologize. I think the area that will come in, and I think the intelligence community and the think tank community will come in, is identifying the cost-benefit analysis. And I think that's why, Christina, you can correct me and add, but I think why we're seeing so much discussion with our European partners about kind of boosting that defense and boosting that internal sort of military defense abilities and capabilities so that it is not so dependent on U.S. Now, that being said, should there be some sort of simultaneous conflict, that would still very much stretch this thing, and we would have to have a serious conversation about cost benefit and where we need to put resources.
I think I would just add that, what we keep talking about today is our adversaries are working together. And so we need to work with our partners and allies across the world. As Johanna just said, they're doing this a lot with Europe right now, especially under the new Trump administration, really pushing them to boost their own defense industrial base, to shoulder more of their own defense requirements, as well as the new deal that he announced in the meeting with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, where the U.S. will be selling weapons via NATO that Europe will be paying for. So this is finding creative ways to lean on partners and allies is definitely something we should be looking at.
Here's an email question. said for some time reports of the Russian economic demise have been prevalent. One estimate I read was $1 billion a day, 500 million to $1 billion a day. How can the Russian economy support that, particularly if we put additional economic sanctions on Russia?
So I'll preface this by saying I am not an economist. I'm not pretending to be an economist. But from my understanding, again, looking at it from more of the battlefield perspective, et cetera, so a little more of, bird's eye view, not getting into the nitty-gritty of macro and microeconomics here, but Russia has been able to rely on certain things like their national welfare fund that has been boosted by 2 decades of really high oil and gas prices that they've been pocketing in this fund, and that fund is significantly decreased. So that's kind of how one of the ways they've been weathering this storm for now. But again, that's finite. So something we're looking at right now is, we're not forecasting that the economy is going to collapse tomorrow. We're not forecasting it's going to collapse in a month. But these are kind of more medium to longer term, in the next year or two, et cetera, that we are looking at. I've seen some numbers saying that all of the intense emphasis and cash going into the defense industrial base was what was really driving their 4% GDP the past few years, which people thought wasn't unheard of. But there are forecasts that all of that boost into the DIB now has kind of come to its end, and that next year's GDP actually will be a lot lower. And again, as I kind of discussed in the talk, boosting the DIB alone has not only kind of neglected some of the civilian sectors in the economy, but has kind of it's overheated the economy. So, and we actually are seeing some Russian officials themselves, some very brave Russian officials, are coming out now in the past few months actually in themselves saying the economy is overheating. We need to fix it. And right now it looks like there's a bit of a tension between the presidential administration and the Central Bank of Russia, because it looks like the Putin's administration is kind of dictating what the central bank needs to be doing in order for, thinking more about the image at home and abroad. And there's some people in the central bank who think that these policies are actually just going to make things worse. But they have to follow through, because when Putin tells you to do something, there's a window. So.
Got Steve, or we got some cards down here. Alan's got a card, a couple more. Okay, just hold those up. Johanna, it was really interesting that you mentioned the best information we had on the damage at the site came not from IAEA, but from Foreign Intelligence Services, which I presume you mean Israeli Intelligence Service. And this gets a little bit to a question here. So when the bombs were dropped, was there any release of nuclear material from that site? And along that line, do we have any better estimate of what the damage to the Fordo site was?
Yes, so that's an excellent question. Yes, I was referring to Israeli intelligence. The Israelis have now released this information. They did an impressive job at penetrating the Iranian nuclear program, which is how they were able to access that information on the program. In terms of, we get a lot of our information on the status of the nuclear program. We're able to pull from a lot of different sources. All right, I'm going to talk loud. My comes back. Sorry, folks. What we have seen so far as open source is we don't have any reports of...
They can't. Okay. I don't know. Let's see. They're coming to the rescue. Here we go.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? All right. So right now we don't have any reports of any sort of radiation coming out of these sites. What we have seen is some of the craters that were made from the bombings. Some of them Iran has covered. It looks like they've either filled in with dirt or they've done that and covered it with tarps as well. But the IAEA has, from their best ability to assess, has not reported any sort of radiation at the sites. Now, when it comes to the actual damage, some of it is still going to be coming out because Iran has not actually accessed these facilities yet. For all of them, particularly Natanz, Fordo, Esfahan, it hasn't even started the excavation process in order to access these facilities. Now, Fordo, we do have a little bit more of an insight into what happened because we're able to identify where these munitions hit within the facility based on a leaked blueprint of the facility from, I believe it was 2013, 2014. And what we were able to see was that several of these munitions hit within a hallway that directly connected to the enrichment hall facility. And what we can determine is that the shock wave or the blast wave from these explosions would have reverberated through the halls. And if anyone here has worked with centrifuges, they're finicky on a good day. These centrifuges are extremely delicate. A shock wave like that would break them and render them unusable, which is why we're able to, right now, assess the damage at these sites. So we don't have confirmation yet. That will likely come once the Iranians are able to access the facilities. Though I would say don't hold your breath for a truthful assessment from the Iranians. We'll probably get it from someone else, either the Israelis or if they let the IAEA in, though that in itself is a long shot. But we're able to assess right now based on, in the open source, that a facility like Fordo would have been damaged, or the nuclear enrichment program would have been damaged. But the actual damage at the other facilities likely will have to come from some classified source for now.
So the president has put a 50-day stopwatch on Russia with the threat of additional economic sanctions. So I think that's early September. Yep. What additional measures do you think he could take, and how effective would they be?
I think we're starting to see this, right? But in terms of what we can do today, what we can do tomorrow, is more support to Ukraine. Ukraine has a manpower issue. That is a Ukrainian problem. Ukraine needs to figure out how to handle that. Where we come into the equation is the weapons and the equipment. Ukraine has shown in the past that when it is well provisioned, it has been really successful. Provisions are absolutely key. They have also shown that despite the incredible advantages that Russia has in manpower, Russia has not been able to restore maneuver to the battlefield. But you know who did restore maneuver to the battlefield, at least temporarily, was Ukraine. So Ukraine has shown that they're incredibly innovative with how they use things. They will take anything we can give them. And this is also just a really great space for us to test out some new things, how they work on the 21st century battlefield. We were talking about drones before with the congressman. U.S. drones need a lot of testing in this battlefield. This is a great chance for us to do that. In terms of the economic things, I understand it's a very complex issue, right? Putting secondary tariffs on countries like India that buy Russian oil, that's going to affect Indian-U.S. relations, right? That is getting a little bit outside of my purview and outside of my portfolio as a Russia analyst, but absolutely targeting any way we can the coffers that Russia is continuing to dip into to try to support this war effort is going to be necessary. But additional things we can do that are important but less direct is really finding ways to crack down on the sanctions evasion. This is just rampant. They're using a lot of Central Asian countries. They're using, countries in Taiwan, countries in Hong Kong. We're getting these companies are all over the world and trying to figure out a way with our European partners to crack down so that when the sanctions we do have in place are actually effective would also be very helpful.
Okay, I want to take a couple from the audience. So if you've got a question, sure who's got the mics? Mike, Mark, Steve? Okay. Let me ask one more here, and then we'll get to you guys. Johanna, it looks like Hamas apparently has been almost put out of business, and Hezbollah to some lesser degree. Do you think there's any way they can reconstitute? And then what about the Houthi? We didn't talk about that as a part of the Axis.
Yes. They can absolutely reconstitute. It's a matter of the timeline. So if we're looking at short-term versus long-term, again, these adversaries have not changed their objectives. We've seen that from their leadership continuing to repeat long-held beliefs, long-held objectives, and that has not changed even after these 2 years. And so even though they have been badly weakened and they are hurting desperately, the fact that these objectives remain is very telling to the will and intent of these actors. And so that's why we look at this in a matter of timeline and not necessarily just a yes or a no. Now, of course, over time, we would look to see if there are indicators maybe suggesting a change or opportunity for there to be a change, but right now we are not seeing that. Now, when it comes to the Houthis have been a particularly interesting actor throughout all of this. The Houthis have been conducting attacks since October 8th and have continued. And there's been a brief period where they stopped attacks on Israel, and that has effectively resumed. Now, the effectiveness of these attacks has also kind of fluctuated a little bit. We've seen some breakouts in technology from the Houthis, largely aided by Iran, to develop more complex drone systems. These are drones that can reach longer. If they can't reach longer, then they have a heavier payload. Right now, that's really kind of the cost benefit that these actors are weighing, which is, do I send a drone longer or do I put a bigger payload on it? Right now, they are opting for a longer range so that they can hit more valuable targets. Because essentially, even if they are not able to do severe damage to Israel with these attacks, they are looking to impose a psychological cost on Israel. It is very scary for a public to have a drone hit a building in Tel Aviv, even if it doesn't do anything, than to have it intercepted just south of Israel over the Red Sea. Now, that's not to say the Houthis will not have success in the future. This is really where the axis of resistance comes into play for Iran and these members, and really when you look at a bigger scale, how the adversary entente functions. These actors are learning from each other. The Houthis in this campaign that they've been waging have almost started to replace Hezbollah, in a sense, in training some of the other members of the axis of resistance in drone warfare. They've been able to take lessons that they've learned from attacks on Israel and teach it to the Iraqi militias. The Houthis now have a headquarters in Baghdad. So does Hamas. That all happened within the past 2 years. So the Houthis, even though they may not have a large impact or shoot particularly heavy munitions or ballistic missiles like Iran or maybe Hezbollah, they have the ability to produce domestically, they are constantly learning, and they are teaching the other members of the Axis.
You know, the Houthis are not even a footnote in the National Defense Strategy, and you figure out what proportion of the Navy surface fleet has been devoted to keeping that part of the Red Sea open. That's a scary thing. Okay. Yes, sir.
This one's for Christina. In the context of the strategic missile threat and long-range drone strike threat from Russia, how does this change given the context of the recent Operation Spiderweb? Thank you.
Yes, so I love that you brought up Spiderweb. So just to make sure everyone's on the same page, June 1st, Ukraine conducted this really incredible operation. They were able to, over a series of months, sneak in really cheap FPV drones or drones into cargo trucks, essentially, and they were somehow able to get truck drivers to conveniently park them near air bases across Russia. And then at a given time, they all flew up and hit all these bombs. It was an incredible display of innovative thinking outside the box, and thinking how to use low-cost equipment in order to destroy millions of dollars of worth of airplanes. So in terms of the long-range strikes that we're seeing with the missiles and the Shahed drones, these have been increasing just exponentially. Between about January and May of this year, they would rarely launch more than 200 projectiles in one night, and then all of a sudden this has skyrocketed. Right now, the record is sitting at, I think, over 750. And what's really driving this right now is the Russian Defense Industrial Base has clearly figured out how to scale up this production such that they can afford to launch these huge swarms over and over and over. I'm going to take a little tangent here for a moment just because it relates to something Johanna was talking about. Right, Iran did supply Russia with the Shahed drones back in 2022. Russia has since almost completely indigenized this production in Russia. There was a lot of question after and during the 12-day war is, how will this damage done of these Israeli strikes in Iran affect maybe Iranian supplies to Russia? And the answer was there was no effect. That relationship has come and gone in terms of it, fulfilled its purpose. Russia now is doing all of it alone with Chinese components, but they are producing all of these alone with the teenagers that I mentioned before. So in terms of how the spider web kind of connects with the drone strikes, I think something we're really seeing is Russia probably feels this need to, we're seeing a shift back, and we've seen this throughout the war, but with this recent drone strike escalation, they're really pushing more towards the psychological warfare of these drone strikes. I will note, though, that ISW actually did look at the data, because one of the questions we had was, did the number of missile launched from these strategic bombers increase after Spiderweb? Was there a correlation? Did Russia all of a sudden feel this need to, or rather, did it decrease? Because was Russia suffering from a lack of strategic bombers to be able to launch these cruise missiles? The answer was no. There was not any kind of correlation in the data, actually. But what might be happening, right, is Russia is seeing an opportunity to try to destroy Ukraine's will. They're targeting major cities. They're using different swarm tactics with their drones to make very precise hits, oftentimes hitting apartment buildings, schools, civilian infrastructure, obviously the critical energy infrastructure. So we're seeing that. But history has shown us over how many decades, right, that strategic bombing campaigns that aim to demoralize the civilians really doesn't work. If anything, it just makes them angrier. So we'll see how this works for Russia, but something tells me the Ukrainians are going to do what they've been doing, which is they unite and they keep fighting.
Okay, we've gone longer than we normally go on these, but I think that's okay because of the depth and breadth of information that we have. I know Scott's got a question. Are there any other questions from the floor?
Couple.
Okay, I see a hand back here.
For Christina, you mentioned the F-16s, and ever since we gave F-16s to Ukraine, I haven't heard one word about them one way or the other. Can you say anything about,
Yes.
are they mainly used for air-to-air, air-to-surface, both, or how are they doing?
So when the F-16s kind of first arrived, or right before, we saw a really concerted Ukrainian effort to try to strike Russian radar systems, right? So this was probably in preparation for the F-16s. Right now, you're probably not hearing a lot about them because Ukraine still doesn't have that many of them. The West has not offered to supply them enough to really make a strong contingent. And also another factor that really is slowing down the process, right, is training the pilots. They have to learn English first to understand the Air Force manual. So that's a little bit difficult, right? So that's definitely slowing the process down. But the way the Ukrainians are using them right now is air defense, particularly combating the long-range overnight strikes that I was just talking about. So obviously Ukraine understands that this is maybe not the best cost-benefit analysis when these Shahed drones that Russia is launching are relatively not that expensive, and F-16, last time I checked, is pretty expensive. So what we're seeing Ukraine do is they're really trying to work on creating these drone interceptors. That would be a better cost-benefit analysis for them. They're making real headway in this. This is a great way that the U.S. can be partnering with Ukraine on this. So I would keep your eye on the F-16s, but you can't really do a ton when you only have a few, unfortunately.
Thank you. Regarding the 10,000 North Korean soldiers.
I was waiting for the North Korea question. Let's hear it.
My question is, what do we know about them as far as their effectiveness and how are they doing?
Absolutely, yes. So after many months of both the North Koreans and the Russians kind of trying to hush up the story that there were 11,000 North Korean forces fighting alongside Russians in Russia's Kursk Oblast, where Ukraine had launched its incursion back in what year is it now? 2020, 3. Time is hard, guys. So in this region of Russia, they employed the North Koreans to help them. At first, they were incredibly combat incapable. These guys didn't even know what a drone was. They didn't understand that you should run away from that. They also, on the other side though, like they had this intense, they were really ready to die. For North Korea. You know, they were told that they were there supporting Russia, North Korea's great, partner, and if they were told to go run after that drone or go try to take that position, they just went yes, and they went. And so that was definitely interesting. After a couple weeks or months of that just kind of slaughter of the North Koreans, we did see them kind of pause just a little bit. We got reports that the Russians were trying to actually train them just a little bit in order to try to not have them all get completely killed immediately. So we did, and so those are definitely lessons they were going to bring back to North Korea, right? So I imagine North Korea right now is working on a new drone doctrine, we have reports coming out of South Korean intelligence that 25 to 30,000 North Koreans might be heading to Russia. There's been some sightings at some of the Il-76 transporter planes that we saw the North Koreans use before when they took them over to Russia, might be used again. So the thing we're going to be looking out for that is, do they actually go into Ukraine this time? That would be a huge inflection that we obviously before Russia only had them fighting in Russian territory itself. And so if they were to cross the border, that would be something we would definitely want to keep an eye out, because that would be a huge major step in the North Korean-Russian relationship and the war writ large.
Okay, let's take one more from the floor. Dave?
Yes, we've got a stated national doctrine that Iran will not get a nuclear weapon. There's two ways to get one. One is to build your own. The other one is to get one from somebody else. What do you think the likelihood is that if Putin finds himself losing in Ukraine, he might threaten to give Iran a tactical nuke as a way of exerting pressure on us and NATO to get out?
I mean, I can briefly just jump in and I'll let Johanna take over, but so far we've seen Russia does not want Iran to have its nuclear program, actually.
Yes, she said that very well. Right now, I think that would be a massive shift in the Russian calculus. We have not seen any indications of that changing at this moment, and so I think that would be a massive, massive change in the Russian calculus to do that.
Okay, so I'm going to turn the mic over to Scott for the last question, but I want to tell you that I've got a stack of cards probably half-inch thick. We just don't have time to get to. So I knew that would happen. I apologize. I know you all had great questions, but I'm just blown away by the conversation here tonight. And we're going to give him a big hand in a minute. But Scott, you have a question?
Yeah, I sure do. Thanks, John. In wrapping this up, first of all, thanks to you both. Incredible. But yes. As I sat here next to my wife over there, I'd look at her and she'd look at me and I'd go, wow, wow. I'd like to know what the take-home is here. Every one of these people have not moved. This is our 19th event, as I said at the top. And I didn't see a door open or a person leave or anybody move to even go to the men's or ladies' room. They were just focused on everything you were saying. So my question to you is, as we do open those doors and we all hop in our cars and we all go home to our respective families and our respective communities, I'm just wondering what you want us to take out of here. You've given us more information than I had in my entire high school career. I mean, this was like going to college all over again. And I tell you what, as I sat there, I was most impressed with what you shared, but I also was most concerned in a lot of ways. And I just wondered what you might share with us as we wrap this up. What are the concerns that we really should have as citizens of this great country? The concerns that we have and what we might do to prepare ourselves for what might be around the next corner. What do we tell our family? What do we tell our friends? What do we tell our sons and daughters? How do we prepare for what's going to be taking place in this world is certainly much different than the one I grew up in. So what I'd like to hear from both of you, just as short and sweet as you can keep it, but to the point as best you can. What do you really want us to walk out of these doors and remember? As a citizen, you better be prepared for this, and here's what you can do. Here you go.
Guess time's up.
Some Ukraine one. Okay. Oh,
There we go.
there we go. Okay. I have three, I'll try to be succinct, kind of Ukraine-related takeaways that I'd really like to leave you with. One is I find it really easy at my job and in the world to look at a map and look at, oh, it's just territory, it's just land. It's people. There are millions of Ukrainians currently underneath what is an incredibly brutal Russian occupation. ISW has done some incredible work about this occupation regime. The stories about them deporting the Ukrainian children, destroying their passports and birth certificates, and giving them Russian children or Russian names, and then teaching them to hate Ukraine, and then training them to join the Russian military are true. So just remember that this is also millions of people in Ukraine, that when we eventually come to a peace settlement and draw a line, those people will be stuck under Russian occupation that they didn't ask for. The second key takeaway I'd like to really impart with you is to remember that when we're kind of assessing Russia's ability to reinvade Ukraine in the future, or maybe invade a NATO state, a lesson we need to learn from late 2021, early 2022, is a lot of people got the Russian invasion wrong of Ukraine because they were so caught up that Russia clearly lacks the capability to do that, and surely Moscow must know that. But they forgot to the other part of the equation, and that's intent. And Putin had the intent to do it nonetheless. So just because in NATO headquarters or in the Pentagon it might look like clearly Russia knows that it can't go up against NATO, doesn't mean he won't try. And then the last thing I would impart with you is that the front lines where they currently are in Ukraine are not defensible. Freezing the current front line is not a solid option. Trump has completely reiterated time and time again that he wants a just and lasting peace. The lasting part there is very important. Defensible lines would require Ukraine to have depth in order to trade space for time. The current front lines are way too close to humongous population centers with millions of Ukrainians, such that Ukraine would have to man those positions 24/7 with a lot of men. This is going to mean Ukraine cannot work on reconstructing its economy and becoming self-sufficient defense industrial-based partner that the U.S. wants it to become. So I'll just leave that for everyone to go think about the implications of that. But where the front lines are today in Ukraine is also not a very good option.
Okay, and so I'll start with the Middle East one, and then I think I have a bit of a large, big picture takeaway here. I mentioned this a few times while I was speaking earlier. When it comes to the Middle East, don't take your eye off the ball. There is a lot of discussion for all the right and all the wrong reasons about whether the United States should be in the Middle East. And I think one of the things we have to be very cognizant about is how we want to engage our partners in the region, because there are long-term strategic interests and threats to the U.S. and those interests. And I think actually going back to the Houthis is an excellent example of this, where the Houthis have, for the time being, paused attacks on some international shipping. They can resume those attacks at any time of their choosing. They retain the capabilities, and what we've actually seen is the shipping costs and the insurance for those ships, the vast majority of international shipping going through those lanes, skyrocketed in 2022 and has not come back down. So a resumption of these attacks would worsen those rates, and it would greatly impact the international economy and shipping. And so that's just one example of one of the U.S. interests in the region. And that's, again, one of those issues that can pop up at a moment's notice. So don't take your eye off the ball when it comes to the Middle East. It will be a long-term interest for the U.S., and we should remain engaged with our partners there to continue to counter these threats. Now, a larger takeaway that I think we all need to be cognizant of is really the theme of today's meeting, which is these conflicts and these issues are not separate issues. They're all heavily intertwined. These partners are constantly learning and constantly talking with one another. And so when we have a conversation about Russia and Ukraine, we also need to be thinking about Iran. We also need to be thinking about our policy towards China and North Korea. What does this look like a year from now or 5 years from now? That's a conversation we need to force ourselves to have, because that's going to span administrations. When we're working against adversaries like Russia and China and Iran, who are dictatorships that can have one guy in power for a very, very long time, the policy doesn't change. And so I think collectively we need to have a very kind of thorough discussion about how all of these things are interconnected and how we need to be looking further out into the future to really counter them.
Ladies, thank you. If you remain on stage while we finish up, I'll turn it back over to Scott, but let's give him one last round of applause.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, outstanding, ladies. And you know who else did a